It's time for the Kalashnikov. I saw last night that Hikaru Nakamura had played the Kalashnikov in the American Cup tournament taking place at the moment in St. Louis. And this is a really interesting game. So let's plunge in. So with white, Leinier Dominguez, now representing America. And with black, Hikaru Nakamura. It's a classical game. And that's interesting because although Hikaru has played the Kalashnikov before in... well, he has played in classical games, but uses it in rapid as well. So it's great to see him actually playing it in a proper serious game. Now, what I like about this move is that really white only has one decent move here. Knight f5, knight f3, knight e2, knight b3, knight c6. They're all substandard. The only move where white can try for the advantage is knight b5. But of course, this becomes very complicated. If you want details of that, then do check out my course on Chessable, where I go into all those alternatives. Knight b5. So white wants to come in here. Now the old line was the Löwenthal with a6, but d6 is the Kalashnikov variation proper, stopping that knight coming in. And then white has to think about, well, what happens with that knight on b5? So there are two main lines. One is to play pawn to c4, going for a Marozzi bind, and the other is to play the knight out c3, and that's what Dominguez does here. They're played in roughly equal proportions, c5 or knight c3. So the knight gets pushed back to the side, and that's going to have to reroute into the centre at some point. And here in my course, I recommended bishop e7, which I'm very happy with. The old main line is b5, which... well, it's interesting. I don't think it's as good as bishop e7 or indeed bishop e6. And bishop e6 is the other main move in this position, which I also rather like actually. I almost recommended it in place of bishop e7, but I slightly prefer bishop e7. So this is the one that Hikaru went for, and this is also very interesting. This is where the bishop belongs in this whole variation, covering the d5 square. And of course it prepares potentially to bring the rook to c8. Knight c4. The knight heads back into the middle. And one can play b5 here. But Nakamura plays rook b8. And this is a very trendy line. This... well, played by Rajabov, but probably the greatest exponent of it in the past few years is Parham Maghsoodloo, former world junior champion from Iran, who has had some tremendous results with the Kalashnikov. And this is a real speciality of his. So black is just hanging back before committing to b5. And the rook can be very usefully placed supporting that b pawn. Now, it's quite a subtle continuation. So, for example, if the knight comes back to e3, preempting b5, you don't actually have to play b5 here. You can just start developing on the king side. Knight d5 played. Now, that's interesting because in looking at the clock times, Dominguez in this position after rook b8 thought for 22 minutes. Now that's a real chunk of time. So he was obviously rather taken aback by rook b8, although as I said, it's quite a trendy move at the moment. But it shows, he's not entirely familiar with this position. Now, after knight d5, Nakamura took straight away. And pawn takes, so white at least gains a bit of time. If queen takes, then black will just play knight f6 and hit the queen. So pawn takes hits the knight, which spins back to e7. So there's a bit of a traffic jam of pieces on the king side. However, you notice the pawn structure. The pawn structure has changed. Black has this nice clump of pawns all the way across from the king side. 5 pawns together. And this is a kingside pawn majority. Whereas white has the majority on the queen side. So the pawn structure really sort of delineates play over the next few moves. Well, in fact, I would say the entire game. So that's really important to get a handle on what's going on in the pawn structure. More on that in a second. G3. Again, after a bit of a think, 8 minutes, whereas, Hikaru was playing quite quickly. So G3, white wants to bring the bishop out. Black has a big choice here. Do you play G6? Do you play F5? Do you play Queen C7? Well, Hikaru goes for B5, pushing the knight. Knight E3, and then he goes G6, and I think that's a prudent move. You don't have to lunge forward with the F-pawn here. It's unlikely that black is going to be able to push forward too quickly because that will expose that square on E6. Imagine if a bishop landed there, that's not great. And, let's just develop as quickly as possible. And, well, again, more on this later. This, I think, is a very sensible decision. I often say that I think a lot of players would improve if they simply remembered keep that pawn on F7 or indeed F2. You don't have to advance the F-pawn. You've got to pick the moment for it. A4. So Dominguez, again after I think 7 minutes thought over A4, decides to soften up these pawns on the queen side, which looks like a very sensible decision. So knight F6. So as the queen side is opening, Nakamura decides to develop as quickly as possible. Now that is very sensible. You certainly don't want to be flying the F-pawn up the board. It just takes too long. Time is of the essence in most openings, but I think especially here where black is going to take a bit of time to bring the king to safety. And you can see the A file is open. So Dominguez has certainly gained something from that little transaction. Bishop G2. And this is a very interesting moment. How many of us would play Bishop G7 here? But Hikaru, after almost 5 minutes thought, plays Bishop H6, and this turns out to be an excellent move. So it's just a little bit more actively placed here, and just has the knight in its sights. And if that knight moves, then the bishops can be exchanged. Both sides castle, and Queen D3. So bringing the queen off the back rank, looking at this pawn. Knight D7 I like. So the knight swings around here, and this is very often an important square. Bishop D2. So Dominguez has succeeded in connecting the rooks, which looks very sensible. You never know. Might be possible to bring the rook down and support it with the other rook. Again, here is a very interesting moment in the game where Hikaru declines to advance the F-pawn. Again, how many of us would simply want to throw that one down the board? But remember, it does expose the king. At some moment, black might pay the price here. And it's not exactly clear what this does. I mean, maybe we can advance. But I just think it's quite telling that Hikaru is actually very prudent here. And instead, after almost 11 minutes thought, plays knight c5. And then, again, not f5, but just queen c7. Very calmly played by Hikaru. I like this. Now, he might be building up for f5, but notice how he's covered the 7th rank first. and he might play on the queen side. Now here Dominguez makes a really committal move. He plays b4. Now perhaps he was frustrated at not making greater progress on the queen side. But watch what happens with b4. Now those pawns are ragged. If black can stabilise the position, then black could just be a lot better here, because look, there's a huge hole on c4. There's a backward pawn here. The d5 pawn, yes, it's protected by the bishop, but actually it can't be protected by a pawn. Now why's Dominguez done that? Well, he wants to gain the initiative on the queen side. He's trying to target that pawn. I mean, maybe he's also thinking about c4 at some moment. Now, if black were to defend that pawn, let's say queen b7, rook a1, and this one can come in here. So you can see what Dominguez is trying to do. He's trying to gain the initiative and tie black down. But this is where I think, again, Hikaru makes an excellent decision. He gives up that beautiful dart-squared bishop for the knight. Bishop takes, and then knight f5. So that's taken a bit of pressure off, actually. It means that, well, if this is taken, watch what happens. Knight takes. Now, if pawn takes, then knight b6. Black gives up a pawn, but if that knight can land on c4, then, well, that gives black such great control over the queen side. And if, let's say, this, well, material is now even. Ask yourself who's better here. And let's just think back ages ago when I mentioned that beautiful row of 5 pawns all together, and they can protect each other. And look at white's pawns. Absolutely ragged. C pawn potentially weak. King also doesn't look great, and that's another factor in this position. Black has a safer king. So white has to be extremely careful. But of course, giving up that dark-squared bishop has consequences. So black has to take care of the king side. Rook a7 hits the queen. Rook b7. Everything okay. Now maybe white should have just supported that one. But still, I mean, I think black is okay there. Let's rattle on with the game. It's quite a long game. But basically at this point, well, I think you can see that Hikaru has now taken control of the A file. That seemed very unlikely a few moves ago. And these pawns leave that massive gap here, and indeed a backward pawn on c2. Structure is really nice for black. Can you control the bishops? Can you keep a safe king? These are the questions. Rook a2. Remember, this was a classical game, but Dominguez had used up a lot of time. And in fact, you know, he was already approaching time pressure. You know, it was a little bit uncomfortable. King g7, everything protected. Bishop h3. Okay, these bishops are starting to work. And on every turn, black has to think, okay, what's going on here? Well, obviously the knight on f5 is attacked. Hikaru had a 19-minute think here. 19 minutes. And this is a really critical position. And black has several options here, some safer than others. He makes a remarkable decision, actually. But I think this is something that Hikaru is brilliant at. Sensing when is the right moment to push things further, keep the pressure on his opponent. So, for example, you could fall back here with a knight. It's attacked. And white could take and then go f4. Now, it's risky for both sides because this exposes white's king, but black's king is also coming under fire. But black should be okay there. You could also simply do this. It's not entirely stupid. But, well, black's king again comes under a bit of pressure. But knight d4 was played. Okay, what happens after c3? Well, look at this remarkable move. Knight c2. Now, in order to play this, you need incredible nerves because that knight could easily be trapped here. It's also, a long way from the king. So the king, well, it seems to be holding. But, yeah, is that knight actually safe on c2? This is an incredible decision. Now here Dominguez plays queen f3. I just want to show you what happens on rook d2. Now black has various options here. But let's look at rook a1 check. And in fact, I think best play should be rook d1 and rook a2 and a repetition here and so on. But just watch this. Rook d2, rook a1. Bishop f1 could be plausible in the sense that, you want to try and trap the knight. But actually, this is an incredible variation. Now, this is not all completely forced, but it just shows you the kind of tricks that white has to be aware of. It could be that black is just losing material here. But watch. Well, I'll hand it over to you. How should black play here? Black's play. This did not happen. I should emphasize. This did not happen. Knight e3 is an absolute killer. It's brilliant. Now, if queen takes queen, we have knight f3 check and rook f1. And if queen takes knight, this is a good one. Queen g2, knight f3. Double checkmate. Absolutely brilliant. So I can imagine that Dominguez was looking at this stuff and thinking, whoa, come on. Okay, this is scary. In fact, rook d2 I think is the best. But anyway, queen f3 played. Hitting the knight, which dropped back to g8. Now, this knight actually does a fantastic job on g8. Covering these squares. And although it was scary to get rid of that dark squared bishop, in fact, the knight does a brilliant job of covering here. And there's no way through. Black's king is safe. Bishop f1. Bishop fell back, looking at that. Now here, I was really surprised by Hikaru's next move. But again, I think well, I should explain. He played rook a3. And this is unbelievably tricky because you can see that maybe black wants to take here. Maybe play knight d4, exploiting the pin. And maybe targeting this pawn. But it kind of leaves the knight in a funny position. To my eyes, knight a3 is a very natural move. Bringing the knight to safety. And spinning back to the c4 square. And I think black has a big positional advantage there. But rook a3 is super tricky. And again, it's this remarkable ability that Hikaru has to sense the moment. Sense a move that is going to be very uncomfortable for his opponent. Bishop c1 played. Rook b3. This is really a strange position. In fact, it seems that with accuracy, white can hold with queen d3, but, well, I won't go into detail, but it should sort of fizzle out to a draw. But, calculating that is extremely difficult. But the game went queen e4. Attacking this. Rook takes c3. Bishop b2. So, who knows? Perhaps Dominguez was hoping to get some kind of hit here or maybe use this. But knight f6. And now black is definitely on top. Rook b3. Keeping active. Attacking this one. Attacking that one. The bishop came back. And once again, white wants to get in on those dark squares. So knight g8. Still a good move. It's actually a very common defensive idea that the knight covers these squares with the king on g7. Queen d8. Ooh, scary. Where's this one going? In fact, not so scary. Queen e7 covers everything. And this endgame. Remember, black is a pawn up. This one is vulnerable. And don't forget that beautiful d4 square. Yes, the good old Trojan horse. That's so often in the Kalashnikov. A knight ends up on d4. So Dominguez avoided the endgame with queen a5. But what do we know about queens on the other side of the board? A long way from the king. Yes, the queen is in Siberia. The knight lands on the dream square d4, the Trojan horse on d4. Bishop e3 and knight f3 check. And now black is swinging pieces over towards the king, while white's queen is stuck across the other side of the board. If queen takes, then this is an absolutely killing move. Threatening queen f3 check, threatening the queen, and if bishop takes, queen f3. And that one's hanging. So bishop e2 covers the f3 square, hits the knight. e4. So black finally uses this extra centre pawn, this kingside pawn majority. And notice, with that pawn on f7, there's no counterplay. That's the problem. Problem for white, but black's king is completely secure behind those pawns. Think about this position when you're tempted to advance your f-pawn. You don't always need to use the f-pawn to attack. Queen takes b5. And queen b2. In fact, this exchange sack is already incredibly powerful, and this knight is going to end up here. But queen b2 also very strong. Hitting that one. If bishop takes, then rook takes is very powerful using that pin. Queen a6. I mean, this sort of preempts rook takes b4, but I think it's a sign that white is struggling. Knight f6. Wow, the next one comes in. And, I mean, white is completely tied up here. The queen has to keep hold of the bishop. It's such an awkward position. h3 stops the knight coming into g4, but now h5. The classic attack here. King f1, there really is no defence at this point. Queen e5. Switching back. So be careful. Black is looking to take here and take here. King g2 covers. The exchange sack anyway. And h4. And yep, the good old h-pawn, as is so often the case, just prizes open the king. And obviously that's a threat. That was taken. Queen h2 and mate next move. So here Dominguez resigned, of course. If this, then queen g1 checkmate. So what was behind Nakamura's victory? Well, first of all, I think he caught Dominguez by surprise with the opening. This whole line with rook b8. Obviously Dominguez was unfamiliar with it. And, well, I think they just got an interesting position out of the opening, but Nakamura understood it better. Bishop takes e3. Slightly surprising, this whole bishop h6, but an excellent move, giving up the second bishop, but it worked out perfectly. And remember that pawn structure. This is an absolutely beautiful position. So superior pawn structure, safe king, and then at this moment an absolutely brilliant and daring idea of putting the knight on c2. That is not easy to judge. Nakamura judged it brilliantly. And then at the end, yeah, beautiful attack using that kingside majority that you see so often in the Kalashnikov, actually. there we go. Underpinning everything, a healthy pawn structure. And who had the safer king? Black had the safer king. If you're interested in learning more about the Kalashnikov, then do check out my course on Chessable. You'll find the link somewhere down there in the comments or in the video description. Great to see the Kalashnikov in action.